Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Scott Cooper. Scott is a national youth advocate and a writer with special focus on coping skills for young people. His previous books include the award-winning Speak Up and Get Along and Sticks and Stones. He is also COO in private industry and was previously a consultant to companies in the environmental planning and design industries. He has been an active student in the realms of philosophy, human well-being, science, and lives in Northern California. The book is Rock and Water, The Power of Thought and the Peace of Letting Go. Scott, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
This is a great book. I enjoyed reading it cover to cover. And I want to start with a thought in the prologue that I hadn't thought much about, and that is that happiness is an instinctive interest of all people. You talk about how many philosophers and sages in all different religions have suggested ways to pursue happiness, and I hadn't thought much about that.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, we're emotional creatures, if you will, and much of our well-being is based on, the emotional experiences that we have and the emotions that naturally come to us. And it's of innate interest, obviously, for all of us to have those emotions be those of content and peacefulness and happiness. Academics refer to happiness as subjective well-being because it's a little bit different for everybody. But at the end of the day, we all have an innate interest, strong desire for having subjective well-being in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Now, this book has two parts, Rock and Water. Rock is the power of thought, and it's based in cognitive psychology. And there are some skills that are pretty much based on cognitive psychology in the first half. And in the second half, the Peace of Letting Go, Water, has some other ideas that are useful. But let's look at some of the skills. The first skill is upgrade your mood by upgrading your thinking. And you talk about emotions there. And emotions, some of our emotions are, as you say, imperfect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would be wonderful if we just had fear, emotion of fear when there was a true threat going on in our lives, or worry only when we had really important things to plan out for the future. But the reality is that we all have these negative emotions that can be useful, but we can all have them when they're not useful, or we can have them too often or too intensely. So cognitive psychology really developed in the 1960s out of the University of Pennsylvania. And the idea behind cognitive psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology, is that we can, our emotions oftentimes flow from our thinking. And so if we can change our thinking, if we can especially work on cognitive distortions or thinking mistakes, things like exaggeration, things like seeing only the bad, those kinds of habits. If we can alter those habits, we can have an important effect on unuseful, non-helpful, negative emotions as they creep into our lives.
Very good. So that encompasses some ideas from both skill number 1 and skill number 2, noticing and responding to thinking mistakes. In skill number 1, you encourage us to think about things that would generate positive emotions, like happiest childhood memories and most enjoyable things in our life, or a special loved one, or things for which we're grateful. But it also ties into thinking mistakes. You mentioned exaggerating, and seeing and forecasting only the bad, and labeling, and extreme blaming, and emotional reasoning, and those are unproductive thinking patterns.
Yeah, that's correct. And so, again, the core idea behind cognitive psychology is the notion that, in fact, it isn't always a situation that drives our unpleasant emotions, but it's our perception of situations. And we need to have reasonable, realistic perceptions in order to deal adequately and to cope adequately with life. But the reality is that sometimes our thinking can make things darker, more difficult than they actually are. And so, again, in the cognitive psychology world, there have been categories developed which relate to these cognitive distortions, these thinking mistakes that we can make. And I refer to about 5 of these in my book. In the larger academic world, those categories can be as many as 15, but I think it gets a little bit complicated. The core idea is that, again, we can influence our level of subjective well-being or happiness by, in fact, correcting some of our thinking mistakes and making our thinking more reasonable, more flexible, and more realistic, so that we're not beating ourselves up.
In the context of realistic, let's talk about what reasonable optimism is.
Yes,
how would you define that?
Yeah, so in my book I talk about, this comes out of the work of Martin Seligman, also a former professor at the University of Pennsylvania. You'll see a pattern here. That university has really focused in on practical, positive psychology in the modern era. And reasonable optimism is, you can look at a storm brewing coming, and you can focus only on the clouds, only on the rain, and think of it purely negatively, or you can avoid the clouds and rain and not worry about it. Both of those are kind of extreme reactions to events in life. And so reasonable optimism is looking realistically at life, but then also using elements of hope and not thinking that things are necessarily going to be terrible, that you can deal with them and so forth. So Seligman doesn't think that optimism is so much positive thinking as it is non-negative thinking, just making sure that we're not allowing overly negative, exaggerated thinking to overcome our internal lives and to help us deal with events more positively.
Mm-hmm. And I like that take on it, because it's so many books about be positive don't really give you access to what that's like.
Right.
In the book, you also talk about core beliefs and values and how that affects us. Core beliefs about ourselves and others in life, and how to behave, and we need to choose sensible core beliefs.
Yeah, one of the other core elements of cognitive behavior psychology is that, well, sure, you can change your thinking habits and try to focus a bit on the thinking mistakes that you might be making in your life. But what if your core underlying beliefs haven't been adjusted? I mean, maybe your core belief about yourself is too negative. Maybe your core belief about the world and life is too dark. Maybe your take on others. I mean, we're seeing this played out. I hate to say this. I don't want to get too political about this, but we're seeing this in our political world in the country, where people are taking such stark positions that it affects how they relate to each other and how they their own subjective well-being. And so some of that is driven again by our core beliefs. And so in the book, I again refer to some of the outcomes, these wonderful outcomes that have come from studies and clinical work in cognitive psychology, where if we can, in fact, eliminate some of the ongoing labels that we're using, use some Socratic reasoning in challenging our beliefs that may be feeding into undue pessimism, then we have a stronger chance of having a more holistic, getting back to feeling better more often. But if we don't deal with underlying beliefs that are feeding into thinking mistakes, sometimes just changing our thinking mistakes will not be enough.
So I do want to go back to the Socratic approach there, because there are some questions you suggest that people ask to test whether or not a belief is reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, for example, asking ourselves the legitimacy of beliefs. Beliefs don't come out of nowhere. They've come from either our family or from our society, and asking ourselves questions about the basic question: do they do us any good? What are our beliefs? Are they doing us any good? Are they really true, or are they assumptions we've developed and have merely accepted? So, again, I have some very specific questions in the book itself that people might want to look at, but that is a core approach by cognitive psychologists in helping people to look at and assess beliefs in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And one of the beliefs that drives a lot of people to frustration, you mentioned what it is, and then a reasonable belief in its place. The greater our expectations that life isn't supposed to be this way, the greater our inner turmoil. There's a lot of people say, it's not supposed to be like this, and they live out their lives frustrated by that. Right?
That's right. And so, again, this gets back to being reasonable and realistic in how we see life and how we deal with the thoughts and feelings that are flowing through us. But you're absolutely right. Here we are. For me, one of the core fundamental purposes of life, and maybe the core purpose of life, is to experience it. And if you're not seeing it for what it is, then your expectations will never be met.
Yes. Because in reality, and you say this in the book, life is a mixture of joy and pain.
That's exactly right. And that's anybody. This is not based on anything that anybody needs to study or research. You can see it for yourselves, right? We can see it for ourselves every day.
Mm-hmm. Another key tool that you bring up is problem solving and solution thinking, and that's a fundamental skill. And you have some strategies for that, including Ben Franklin's balance sheet and solution planning and so on.
That's right. And solution. So this goes back to, again, taking on a practical, reasonable approach to living, and just there, as I mentioned earlier, there are situations that can be improved by how we perceive them, but in many cases, those situations remain, and if they're problematic, we need to solve them. Right? We need to solve our problems in order to have well-being in life. So, cognitive behavioral psychology, I emphasize now the behavioral side of that, isn't just changing your thinking; it's actually doing something about your problems.
Yeah, and the next skill is upgrade your mood by jumping in, because the second element is activating behavior, right?
That's correct. And there have been numerous studies on behavior activation, which is simply, doing things even if you don't feel like it. Motivation, some people have the impression that you need to be, motivation precedes action, but actually, based on work done at the University of Washington, for example, on behavior activation, actually doing things first will lead to motivation. And so jumping in when we don't feel like it can be one of the most powerful elements of developing greater subjective well-being.
Yes, and I didn't have that in my consciousness, that action often precedes motivation. I didn't know that. Yeah,
it's very true, actually. I mean, it certainly can work both ways, but more often than not, people get motivated after activating their behavior rather than waiting for motivation to, spring up in their heads.
So you have a little bit on cosmic beliefs, and I was interested in that because you said we share a capacity to naturally experience spiritual and religious influences, and
going back to core beliefs and developing beliefs that are reasonable, and especially beliefs that are helpful to us. Sometimes our beliefs about the larger purpose of life and our place in it can be either helpful and useful. It can be reasonable, unreasonable. But whatever our beliefs about a larger purpose in life, it's important to take some time to determine what those beliefs are and to feel comfortable with them, so that there's this underlying foundation to our belief system and to our thinking habits. And so my plea with that chapter is simply that people take a look and think through your larger beliefs about the purpose of life and your role in it. And you know, whether that's naturalistic or whether that's religion based, I think the key is to get into a place where you're comfortable, at peace, to contribute again to your subjective well-being.
And you have a statement in there that I think is a statement on spiritual wellness, and a belief in a purposeful guiding power can be a source of peace and strength.
Yeah, it certainly has been true for me, but it's not for everybody. And as I say, I think there's room for all sorts of beliefs, whether it's a religious belief or whether, again, it's more naturalistic. I think the key is getting to a place where you're at peace and don't have to have conflict over that important part of life on an ongoing basis.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to part 2, water, the peace of letting go. The first skill is about simple forms of letting go, and it addresses the Eastern philosophy of detachment, which I think is important.
Yeah, so I wanted to combine 2 important elements in this book for subjective well-being, because I think they're both important, and most books do not sort of integrate the 2. So the first, as you mentioned, is cognitive behavioral psychology, working on our thoughts and beliefs. And the second part of the book is based on the aspect of using mindfulness and acceptance practice to increase our subjective well-being by realizing that we need to accept things we cannot easily change or that we don't have any control over. And so coming to that realization and starting to practice less attachment, less desire for things can also be very powerful in assisting or abetting our subjective well-being.
I think a lot of us in the West are not clear how to access mindfulness readily. What tips do you have for getting to mindfulness? Yeah,
it's such a hot topic, has been for the last decade, and I think that, you know, Googling, I certainly summarize both mindfulness and acceptance practice in their sort of modern forms. But I think Googling around, people can find quite a bit on mindfulness. For me, the core principle is to accept life with less judgment, and less reaction. So it's learning to calm the mind by letting things be, by simply, you know, the formal practice is to actually, in meditation, is to actually sit and focus simply on one's breath, or if it's yoga, focusing on your yogic positions. But it's putting a focus on one point of interest and letting go of everything else, and especially letting go of judgment and reaction in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also give a tip there from the Dalai Lama, who suggests that we notice the feelings we have toward others and let go of dislike and anger to fill our hearts only with happy emotions. And I think that's a nice key to as well.
Yeah, he's written so many wise things, and that's certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. Part of acceptance is accepting the fact that we must have some pain in life, like grief.
No, this is absolutely right. And so, you know, there have been studies about happiness that generally confirm that maybe, you know, 50% of our well-being is based on our genetic set point, They were sort of born with an innate disposition, and maybe 50% we can really do something about beyond our basic nature. But the thing that can even raise our well-being even further is acceptance. Because if we accept our, some of this innate suffering, if we accept the difficulties of life a little bit more, with less fighting of those events, we can actually, regardless of our innate disposition, I think we can increase our well-being further by learning to accept things more fully. There have been, I just want to comment just briefly on a couple of important studies that came out in 2017 about learning to accept our emotions themselves. One was at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, and the outcome of that was that after studying about 1,000 students, was that when students accepted their negative emotions more fully, as opposed to trying to fight them and resist them and counter them constantly, they actually felt better. And the reason for this is because if we're anxious about anxiety, guess what? We're even more, we're even more anxious. So there is a skill, and I detail this out in my book, of learning to accept even our emotions, the emotions that aren't easily changed that come with our human condition. The other study, a multinational study done also in 2017 by about 3 different universities, concluded that in addition, if we have a desire for, they found that if we have strong desire for positive emotions, and then our reality is we don't experience them, we get even more unhappy. So it's almost like if we have less desire, not quite, or I should say strong expectation, if we don't have a real super strong expectation for happiness, we'll probably actually be happier, because of the reality that, we aren't always happy. And so if your expectations aren't met, you're going to be even more unhappy. So the point is that even learning to accept our, the fear, the worry, the guilt, when we have those things when we don't need them, when they're not useful to us, learning to more graciously accept those emotions as part of life can be beneficial to us, as it turns out.
Yeah. And that's poignant, that mentally fighting or denying emotional pain won't make it go away, and so there has to be another skill there that we engage. You talk in skill 15 about letting go of too much self-centeredness, and surrender is in that.
That's right, and that ultimately leads to kindness. And I think we can all agree that most of us can agree that the highest moral attribute is really kindness. Being kind to each other. If we lived in that kind of world, what a world we'd live in. And that is undermined by each of us to the degree we have too much self-centeredness going on in our lives. We have to take care of ourselves and have some self-interest, for sure. But if that goes too far, and we're only focused on ourselves, not considering the lives of others, their emotions, their needs, their desires, and so forth, if it's not a mutually beneficial world, then that's where we come up with this strongly partisan, strongly conflict-oriented world, which we're experiencing to a degree right now. So letting go of ourselves has the wonderful benefit of not only making us less anxious inside, because again, it's one less desire that we need to deal with, but it also has the wonderful outcome of benefiting those around us in the world ultimately.
Mm-hmm. And your definition of kindness is letting go of self, is a powerful definition, but there's also a special type of letting go in that skill chapter, forgiveness.
Yes.
How does that begin?
Yeah. So forgiveness is such a powerful skill, because we can hold on to past things, either things that we've done or others have done, and fret over them and think about them, and it does nobody any good. And so your happiness, your subjective well-being, of course, is going to be in jeopardy without that skill. And so it is a form of acceptance. It is a form of letting go. It doesn't mean that we, let people get away with evil deeds or harmful deeds, but it does mean at the end of the day we need to let go of those kinds of mental issues if we're to find happiness ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of my themes constantly is forgiveness is not for the other person; it's for you.
Absolutely,
and that's important.
Very good point. Very good point.
Another type of letting go is letting go of frustration, and you define that as patience.
That's right, and patience is something where you don't simply give in to people. I mean, there is for all of these things there are reasons for us to have some of these unpleasant emotions and frustration. There's a reason for frustration. If things are unjust in the world, if people are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, if they're not playing their role, then frustration has a role, but it's how we then respond to that. And we're better off if we can respond to that frustration with sort of strong determination going forward, but without the pain and anxiety of anger or being spiteful, that sort of thing. So it's a matter of, again, it's this balance of feeling the frustration, but responding to it with acceptance for the situation, but response to the situation without anger and without anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Under mindfulness, we talked about some stuff in this Skill 18, meditation for the non-practitioner. But are there other things besides yoga and meditation that would help the non-practitioner?
Yeah. Well, the Dalai Lama, I go back to him, has this wonderful definition of meditation. In his book, believe it or not, because he's so focused on meditation and mindfulness, but he said that meditation is really to help the mind be peaceful. And so in my book, then, any activity that can help the mind be more peaceful is a form of meditation. And that can be anything from, going out on a nice hike, or it can be enjoying a book. I mean, which is what your program is about, enjoying a good book. Mm-hmm. Not all of us are made up naturally to be. It's not natural for us to do meditation or mindfulness or other more structured sorts of forms of meditation. But all of us can do something we enjoy, or find pockets of time in our day to just rest our minds. And so meditation, as the Dalai Lama has defined it, is much broader. And it's almost any activity, whether active or less active activity, that can help our mind to be more peaceful.
One last thought in the epilogue. You say that being overly attached to the goal of happiness can reduce the quality of our inner lives.
Yeah, and that goes back to this study that I mentioned earlier, where there in 2017 there are some really helpful findings that if our expectations for positive feelings are too strong, and those expectations aren't met, we're going to be even more dissatisfied and unhappy. So there is something very, very important, if nothing else, that people get from this conversation. I hope they get the value of learning to accept more fully our human condition. There are things we can do things about. There are things that we can control, but much that we can't, including our emotions, our natural inborn emotions from time to time. we sort of have this innate, anybody who's raised children knows that young children, they can have extreme emotional suffering even when their physical comfort really isn't that bad off. So we are born with some level of suffering, emotional pain, regardless of the event, even regardless of the events in our lives and so forth. And this plays out in the extreme forms of depression and those kinds of things. We don't choose those things; they come to us. So if our expectations are too high for happiness, and those expectations are not met, we're going to be even more dissatisfied. So emotional acceptance is an important skill, I think, for all of us to develop to some extent.
Excellent. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. We've been talking with Scott Cooper. The book is Rock and Water, The Power of Thought and the Peace of Letting Go. I believe this will help you peacefully navigate the unpredictable path of life, as the book blurb says. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't catch our regularly scheduled broadcast, you can also hear us on our YouTube channel, Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening, and make it a great day.